Hi everybody, in this chapter we are going to talk about language acquisition. In a series of videos, we go through different topics as related to language acquisition as a first language and as a second language. In this video, we are going to talk about language capacity of children, what are the hypotheses about language acquisition and how they are supported, and we talk about the different stages that children go through in order to learn language. In the next video, we will talk about how children are learning different language modules like phonology, syntax, semantics. And we finish this chapter by the discussion of how is it that children are learning second language and what are the advantages of learning a second language. So back to language capacity of children. The capacity to learn language is deeply ingrained in us as a species, just as the capacity to walk, to grasp objects, to recognize faces. We don't find any serious differences in children growing up in congested urban slums, in isolated mountain villages, or in privileged suburban villas. So here, what does it tell us? It tells us that it doesn't matter whether you are in Iran or in England or in any other country throughout the world. As a species, we have an ability to learn the language. And this capacity, this ability to learn the language is something that we are born with. And it's so wired within us that it can be compared to how we use our ability to walk. So, however, we go through stages in learning to walk, but we are not taught how to walk. But there is some predisposition in us that enables us to walk and to do other activities, other cognitive activities. Chomsky has also said we are designed to walk. That we are taught to walk is impossible. And pretty much is the same about language. Nobody is taught language. In fact, you can't prevent the child from learning it. So the moment a child is exposed to a situation, to an environment in which one language is used, the child would learn the language of their surrounding, and the basis, the foundation of that language is genetically inherited. It's within us, and it is being called language faculty. So we as human beings, we are born with language capacity, with language faculty. And that we learn different languages is because we are exposed to different languages. As we will see later, this language capacity is the same in all infants. What makes the difference is the environment in which infants are brought up. If you're brought up in an environment in which Persian is spoken, then the infant would learn Persian. If they are born in a family in which, or in a country, in an environment in which French is spoken, then the child would learn French. But the ability with which this Iranian or French infant is born is the same. There is no difference, except for what we can say about cognitive abilities, that's something else about the exceptions. But we are talking about a normal human being. When we are born with the ability to learn the language, and we bring something with us. That is, we have the genetic basis to learn the language. And that is what the innateness hypothesis says, that children are equipped with an innate template or blueprint for language. This is universal grammar. You are familiar with this idea of universal grammar. And this blueprint is there, and the child would use it in order to learn different languages. And what the task of each child is that they would have the task of constructing the grammar of their surrounding language, the language they are exposed to. So we have the template, we have the blueprint for language. It's within us. That's universal grammar, and all children are born with that. The only thing that the child needs to do is to use the data, the linguistic data in their environment, and construct a grammar for their language. Do we have any support for the idea that we are born with language faculty? Is there any support for innateness hypothesis? Yes. The grammar that children would learn, it has many abstract rules and structures, but it is not there in the linguistic data and the linguistic input that they receive. For example, children are brought up in families in which people, when they are talking to each other, they have sentences full of hesitations. They have sentences in which they might make errors. There are pauses. The sentences are incomplete. So, in spite of incomplete sentences that they hear, they would learn the complete sentence, and they have the linguistic knowledge of the complete sentence. For example, in the environment, the child might hear, "Where have you been?" And the person could say, "At the restaurant." So the answer is incomplete. It's a PP rather than a whole sentence. But what the other person in conversation would infer, and what the child would infer, would be that I've been in a restaurant. So therefore, the linguistic input that the child gets is impoverished. It has lots of errors. It is incomplete. It has lots of hesitations. But in spite of this impoverished data, the child would learn the language as a whole, and they would have the linguistic knowledge of the syntactic structures that are used in that language. However, they have never been taught that in order to make a sentence, you need to use noun phrases and combine that with a verb phrase, then combine that with another noun phrase in order to make a sentence. And that was for English. And for Persian, that you have to use a noun phrase, and that noun phrase can be dropped sometimes, and then you use a VP. In the VP, you have V, and then you have another noun phrase. We are not taught this, but we are talking. Like, you can see in the society, even those people who have never had any course in linguistics, they are using language. Have they been taught directly how to use the grammar of the language? No. They listen, they hear the language, and they would learn little by little what are the rules that are there, and then they arrive at a fully fledged grammar for their surrounding language, be it Persian, English, or any other language that it could be. So, poverty of stimulus is one of the arguments that have been used in order to support innateness hypothesis. That a child would learn a language in spite of the impoverished data that they are exposed to is because they are born with a template, with a blueprint for language. They are born with universal grammar. And what the child would do is to get this impoverished linguistic data and match it with what they know, what they have inherited, the language faculty, the universal grammar, and there would be this surprising, astonishing act of learning the language. You have seen that children at age 3 or 4, they learn the language in a very spectacular way that we are surprised how a child would tackle this job, this activity. Just think of adult learners of foreign languages or second languages. So it takes time for them to learn the language, but the child at the age 3 or 4, they learn the language to the full. It can be the case that what they produce is still, it has some errors, but the thing is that the knowledge that they have is complete. And you remember what we had there as a difference between language competence and language performance. Language competence is what we know about the language, and language performance is how we produce the language. The child has this linguistic competence about the language and it's complete. However, they might have some errors in the production. So, the first argument then says, however, the data the child is exposed to is impoverished, but the language that they develop is a fully fledged, complete language, and it's because they are not starting from scratch, but that they have started from a template, a blueprint they have inherited. Another argument is that, however, children are exposed to language in different environments. For example, in some societies, children are worthy of being talked to as an adult, even like an adult. Like the way they would talk to an adult, they would talk to the child. But in some cultures, the children are looked down at and they are not taken as good partners in conversation, and sometimes the infants are referred to by pronouns that would be used in order to refer to objects. We are talking about different environments and how they treat infants as a partner in conversation or as some object that doesn't know the language, and up to the time that they do not know the language, they are not worthy of being taught to. In both environments, the children would learn the language and they would go through similar stages in language acquisition. This uniformity of language development, in spite of the different environments in which they are brought up, is also another argument that supports we are born with a template for learning language. We are born with a universal grammar. We have all those rules, those abstract rules there within our language faculty, and when we are exposed to language, and it doesn't matter whether the child has been taken seriously or not, they would learn the language. It's only important that they are exposed to linguistic input. The rest will be done by the child in constructing a grammar for the language based on the data that they get. And we said the data is impoverished. In spite of that, they would learn the language in a uniform way. And it's rather rapid, and it seems very easy, as we can see that children can learn a language in just 3 to 5 years. This is a very great job that they do. As an evidence for the poverty of a stimulus argument, a structured dependency has been given. However, we have lots of evidence in support of innateness hypothesis, but this is just one of those pieces of evidence that we can talk about, and that's structured dependency. What does the structured dependency say? It says that the rules of a language, the grammatical rules of a language, are not dependent on serial order, on the order in which they appear. That one comes first, and then the second word, and then the third word, and the fourth word. We are not doing rules based on their order in a sentence, but that we use grammatical rules based on their hierarchical structure. And you are already familiar with hierarchical structure. In hierarchical structure, we say we have an IP, and IP is made up of an NP or DP, which becomes the subject, and a VP, and within that VP we have a V and its complement NP. So, in this sentence, the boy is sleeping. How do we change it into a question? By changing the position of the auxiliary. So we change the position of the auxiliary and we put it at the beginning of a sentence, and then we change it into a question. So by moving the auxiliary to the beginning of the sentence, we change it into a question. Now let's see what happens if we have a sentence like, the boy who is sleeping was dreaming. The boy who is sleeping was dreaming. How do we change it into a question? Do we change it into a question by moving the auxiliary of the matrix sentence, which is the boy was dreaming, and then we change the position of was to and move it to the beginning of the sentence in order to change it into a question and say, was the boy who is sleeping dreaming? Or do we move the first auxiliary that we come across and make a sentence like this? Is the boy who is sleeping was dreaming? So sentence number 3 is not grammatical, is ungrammatical, because it's taking out, it's moving the auxiliary that is within the subject rather than within the matrix sentence. So is part of the subject, the boy who is sleeping, and moving is as the first auxiliary that we encounter would result in an ungrammatical sentence like 3. So we pay attention to the hierarchical structure of the sentence, that what are the different constituents in the sentence and which auxiliary should move. And the auxiliary that should move is the auxiliary of the matrix sentence rather than the auxiliary within one of the constituents, for example, NP in this case. And young children do not produce sentences like 3. Why? Because however they have not been taught not to do it, but they know something about the hierarchical organization of the sentences. And it comes from the UG principles. Structure dependency is one of the universal grammar principles, that when we are applying grammatical rules, we look at the hierarchical structure of the sentence and not on their order, on their serial order, in order to apply a grammatical rule. And you see that this bit of information is not provided directly in the input. The child would hear these sentences, the correct sentences, and they would decide that sentences like 3 would be ungrammatical and they would not use it. So the kind of errors like sentence 3 would not be observed in infants learning the language, in children learning the language. So, going back to the logical problem of language acquisition, and what's it? That what counts for ease, rapidity, and uniformity of language acquisition in the face of impoverished data and varying environments? We have 2 things. The environment is different for every child, and the data they are exposed to is impoverished. But in spite of these 2 shortcomings, they easily, rapidly, and uniformly learn the language. Why? How can we account for that? Well, the answer is that children are equipped with UG, with universal grammar, and it constrains the kind of grammatical rules that children would form and predisposes them to follow a certain course of development, that they would go through stages, similar stages. And that's also responsible for avoiding the grammatical errors that you could see if we didn't have any universal grammar. And therefore, we would see that they go through similar and uniform developmental stages. All of the languages conform to UG principles, and therefore the children would learn the language in a similar, uniform way and rapidly. They do not start from scratch, but they start from some basis. And that basis is UG Blueprint, the template for learning a language. So now, the question is, if we know that children are learning the language in a uniform way, what are the stages in language acquisition? And how do we know that children are going through those stages? The methods that we use to study language acquisition are parental diaries, that is, the notes that come from parents. Parents become happy when they hear that their children are speaking. And some parents are interested in keeping notes of their children's development, linguistic development. Some of linguists who have been parents and have been interested in studying child language acquisition, they have kept notes and or knowledge about stages of language acquisition come from their notes. Another method is observation. In observation, what happens is that when children are in, for example, kindergarten, when they are being taken care of by a group of caretakers, then their behavior would be observed. The observation would give information about many children at a time, that is in contrast to what we see in parental diaries. Besides these two that happens in natural situation, as we are observing children playing with each other and then using language, or that parents keep record of their development while they are communicating with their children, or when they are involved in playing. Another method is experiment, which is not natural. This is an artificial setting that is designed carefully, and it controls for the kind of linguistic behavior that we are going to study. For example, we want to study whether infants would perceive contrast, aspiration, for example. Whether aspiration is a contrast for an infant, or is it a phone, just a different physical entity pronounced, rather than a kind of sound that might cause any change in the meaning. Because aspiration in some languages like Thai, it is distinctive, it is phonological. It changes the meaning when we have the same word pronounced without aspiration and with aspiration. However, in English, in Persian, aspiration is just phonetic. It doesn't change the meaning. For example, if we say Thai with aspiration or Thai without aspiration, that wouldn't change the meaning, but that when we are pronouncing the word without aspiration, then it seems unnatural, doesn't seem normal. Or in Persian, when we are producing tup, well, this is the normal pronunciation of the word, but when we say tub, then it seems there is something in the pronunciation, some difficulty in the pronunciation that might come from the person who is pronouncing it, and it doesn't change the meaning of the word, whether you pronounce it with more aspiration or less aspiration. So experiments can be designed in order to study this aspiration, for example. And one of the experiments that have been used come from high amplitude sucking paradigm, in which they would use pacifiers, and then as infants are sucking, then they would measure their behavior, whether they would recognize a certain contrast or not. So the idea is that children go through similar stages. It's, as we have already said, it's because they are biologically equipped with UG, that we have a blueprint, and then infants would use that blueprint for language development. And what makes them different is just the linguistic input that they receive, but the foundation is the same. So before moving on, when we are talking about stages in language acquisition, we have to keep it in mind that the kind of performance or the kind of production that children have are different from adult language, but it doesn't mean that it is a degenerate form of adult language. So if there is any differences between child language and adult language, it is systematic. And the kind of phrases, the kind of sounds, the kinds of words that they would produce, they conform to the grammatical rules of the language that they have learned so far at the stage that we are studying them. For example, if they are making words that have only one syllable, then they have not yet mastered words with more than one syllable, and therefore every word that is pronounced is stressed, for example. Also, the kind of words that they would produce and the kind of phrases that they produce, they have categories and they have rules for building these phrase structures. They know how to make a verb, how to use a noun when they are building phrase structures. And also they follow universal principles, so that if they are making errors, they are not making errors that would violate the universal principles, such as structural dependency. If they make any errors, however, these are not errors, but that they show up, they are reflections of the current stage in which the child is. So if we see any deviation from adult language, it wouldn't be something against the universal principles. In their productions, they observe the universal grammar principles, and they would not violate those principles because they are built in, they are genetically wired. As children are learning a language on the way to a fully fledged language, they are making an internal grammar, and then at each stage this internal grammar would be updated and it would become more and more similar to adult language. But they would start with something simple. As we see, they first make some experimentations with just some sounds, vowels, consonants, and then little by little they start babbling. And after that, they would start producing these babbles as association of form and meaning. And little by little, their first words come into being. And when they learn their first words at the next level, they would be able to combine 1 or 2 or 3 words together to make telegraphic speech or sentences. And after that, which is around between age 3 to 5, then they master the language, and it's very similar to that of adult language, except for very rare cases that they would develop later. So this is stage that all infants are going through up to the time that they master a language, and it's uniform in children learning different languages. What is different is the specifics of that language that they learn. For example, in some sounds, some of the uncommon in some languages, we have some uncommon sounds like th, th, or clicks like and then these would be learned later compared to other sounds that are commonly used in world languages. The thing is that most of the languages are similar. So the first stage in language acquisition is the perception and production of speech sounds. The studies have shown that infants respond to different properties of language. That is, they are sensitive to that. The way that they are sensitive to light, loudness, they respond to different properties of language. How do we know? We said that there's a method in which we design a setting carefully and we study the behavior of infants. So we design experiments. One of these experiments is high amplitude sucking paradigm. In high amplitude sucking paradigm, what happens is that the infant would respond to stimuli when they are new, and when they become old, then the sucking rate decreases. Just imagine that we want to see if an infant in a Persian speaking family would make a distinction between aspirated p or unaspirated p. This distinction, this contrast, does not exist in Persian, because in Persian it doesn't make a difference whether you pronounce pa, for example, with aspiration or without aspiration as by. Pa, 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 pa. So for adults, the distinction between the two is not clear. But when infants are played pa with an aspiration, for the first time their sucking rate increases, because this is a new stimulus. And when it is played repeatedly for several times, then this stimulus becomes old and the sucking rate decreases. And when after pa would be played, which is an unaspirated case of p, the infants would respond to that. by higher sucking rate. That is, they have recognized that sound as a new sound. And it tells the researcher that infants are sensitive to some of the contrast distinctions that adults are not sensitive to. So an adult Persian speaker is not sensitive to the distinction between pa, but an infant is sensitive to this distinction, which is a phonemic distinction in some languages like Thai. Another experiment is the one in which preferential listening technique is used. What happens in this technique is that infants are played sounds or structures, words, phrases, and they would check whether they prefer to listen to that or not. And how we measure this preference? By turning their head. If they turn their head towards those sounds, words, then we know that the child, the infant, knows these sounds. They are familiar because they turn their head towards the sounds and they would listen longer when the sounds, stress patterns, words, and phrases are familiar to them. As we have already said, a newborn responds to all phonetic contrast in human languages, in all of the languages that are spoken throughout the world, even if they are not phonemic in their ambient language, like the case that we talked about in Persian-speaking family. So in Persian-speaking family, the contrast between aspirated and unaspirated p does not exist. But infants are better than adults in distinguishing these phonemic contrasts. Another case is in Japanese. For them, r and l, they are the same for adults. They cannot make a distinction between r and l, and you know that we can make a distinction between these two sounds. Why? Because it is a phonemic contrast in Persian. But this is not a phonemic contrast in Japanese. So they have observed that infants from Japanese-speaking families, they make a distinction between r and l, but adults cannot make a distinction between these two phonemes. So it seems that when infants are born, they are born with a knowledge of all phonemic contrasts that are in world languages. However, one thing happens. After 6 months, the infants filter what they perceive based on their surrounding language. That is, they are no longer sensitive to phonemic contrasts that do not exist in their ambient language. Their perception is shaped by the language that is spoken around them. One thing about babies, because it might have occurred to you that, well, it can be the case that they are not only sensitive to contrasts that they can hear in pa, but that they would respond to any new sound, which is not even non-linguistic. For example, loudness, when you speak louder or when you speak in a quiet sound, or when a certain sequence is spoken by a man rather than a woman, or by a child rather than an adult, then they would respond to that, and they are sensitive to these differences as well. the experiments, the investigations show that babies ignore these non-linguistic aspects of language. So that the aspirated p, if it is uttered by a man, a woman, and louder or a quieter sound, then that wouldn't make any change to the baby's performance, but that if the sound that is the stimulus that is played is a new stimulus with a new feature that would show a contrast, then they are sensitive to that and they respond to that. So, we know that children are born with the knowledge of all sounds and phonemic contrasts that exist in word languages, and they ignore non-linguistic aspects of language, and they respond to linguistic aspects of language. The next stage is babbling. Around 6 months old, infants start to make sounds, even sounds that do not exist in their ambient language, in their surrounding language. And little by little, they combine sounds together, a consonant and a vowel together, and they make longer vowels, which happens by the end of the first year, that we have not only sound but also sound combinations, and it has been mostly customized to reflect the target language, the language in their surrounding that they are going to learn. And therefore, the babbles of a Russian can be distinguished from the babbles of a Persian speaker, and the babbles of a Chinese would be different from that of American child. So babbles become language specific by the end of the first year. But at the beginning, they might even include some sounds or some combinations that do not exist in their ambient language, because the child, the infant, is experimenting with the different sounds that they know. But then they are shaped by what is around them, the language that is spoken around them, and it is affected by the linguistic input that they get from their environment. These babbles, they look like words, but they do not have any meaning attached to them. So it can be the case that parents are really happy that their infants have produced some sequence, but that would be only one time, like one time or at most 2 times, but then they would not be used repeatedly with a certain meaning. It's only when a sound that is produced repeatedly with the same meaning that we can say it's a new word. The features of the babbles is that, well, they contain 12 consonants that are frequently used in word languages, and that makes up 95% of the consonants that the infants would produce. So, the sounds that infants would produce would be the most frequent consonants in word languages. And the early babbles consist of consonant vowel sequences. And at the beginning, they are one syllable like ma, ga, da, and over time they change to two-syllable babbles. Ma, ma, ga, ga, da, da, ba, ba. And these are the most frequent sounds in world languages. Babbling is a linguistic ability related to the linguistic input the child receives. And that's why we can make a distinction between the babbles of a Russian and a Chinese infant. And it is not pure linguistic, and it is not a mere neuromuscular activity, like crying, for example, but that it is related to language. How do we know that? Because neurological studies that they have had brain imaging, they have linked babbling to those parts in our brain that are responsible for language. And the parts that are in our brain and they are connected to language are in the left hemisphere. And neurological studies have shown that these babbles are linked to those places that are specialized for language. So therefore, it tells us right at the time of babbling, like at this stage, or even earlier than that, that brain specializes for language. It happens very early in their life. The babbling prepares children for the next stage, which is first words. After age 1, the child begins to use the same string of words repeatedly to mean the same thing. So it's very important to have this fixed pairing of word and their meaning. So before that, it can be the case that infants would produce some sequences, but since they are occasional and they do not have any fixed pattern, they are random, then you cannot call them first words. The first words would come about when they use a certain form consistently to mean the same thing. For example, here we have some of the production of children. Au, ba, ma, for up, da. So in these, you would see that the kind of words that they are producing are not similar to that of the adult, except for high. But parents would know what they mean, because these sequences are used repeatedly with the same meaning. The stage at which the children would use one word utterance and they would mean a whole sentence is called holophrastic or whole phrase stage. Holophrastic or whole phrase stage. In whole phrase stage, one word is used and it means the whole sentence. For example, ba would be used, but the child would mean that, well, something is up there, give it to me, or put me up there. So the same word is used as a whole phrase. They mean a whole phrase. My nephew used paun for asking me to come down or for asking me to take him upstairs. So they use only one word, but then they are making requests and it is a whole sentence. They mean a whole sentence. Or they would say up, up, up. And then they might mean different things. Right? That I want water. Or that, look, here is water. Or that I am wet. So they mean different things by using just one word. They use one word and they mean one complete sentence. Do we have any evidence for that? Yes, from experiments. The experiments show that what children are producing is way behind what they comprehend. That is, their comprehension, their understanding is more advanced than what they are producing. And their productions would not reflect the grammatical competence, the linguistic knowledge that they have. When we are talking about stages in language acquisition, well, it might come to your mind that how is it that infants, children, would make a guess and then they learn what are the speech sounds and what are the words. Words are a combination of speech sounds. When we are producing a speech like the time I'm speaking, what we are doing is that we are producing several sounds right after each other. And if I've been speaking Korean or Chinese right now, could you guess what is the beginning and the end of words? Except for pauses. Yeah, pauses would come to our help. Intonation would come to our help. But we are not using pauses and intonation throughout our utterances, but that we use them at the boundaries. And within those phrases, chunks that we produce, there are words. How do children would find what are the words of a language? How do they segment speech sounds? And you know how frustrating it is to know what are the words if you do not know the language. Like, you are listening to a foreign language and it's not easy to know what are the words. So, in order to answer this question, we focus on English and give examples from English. In English-speaking children, one of the cues that they would use in order to know what are the words of English is stress. We need to review some of the facts about English stress pattern. One is that content words that are monosyllabic, they are stressed. When they have more than one syllable, then one syllable is stressed, the other one is unstressed. And when the stress is on the first syllable, it's trochaic, and when it is on the second syllable, it is iambic. Paper is trochaic and device is iambic. And the other fact about English stress pattern is that most of the words have trochaic stress. That is, the first syllable is stressed. So, if most of them have their first syllable stressed, then the child would learn that when they come across a stress syllable, most probably that is the beginning of a new word. And that is what the adults do, that they know the word boundary based on stress. And then we have iambic cases, which are fewer compared to trochaic words. So either words are monosyllabic that are stressed, or they are bisyllabic, and within bisyllabic words, trochaic words are more frequent. So now, what happens that babies would perceive stress and would segment the speech that they hear into words. Infants are sensitive to stress, and they quickly acquire the rhythmic structure of their language. I remember that my nephew started using the rhythmic structure of questions a long time before he would be able to say his first words. I remember it was around 5 months old that he started with that. So they know about the rhythmic structure of the language, the intonation pattern of the language, and stress is very salient to infants. And infants, after a few months, they can make a discrimination between what is the stress pattern of their ambient native language and what is the stress pattern of other languages. And before the end of the first year, the babbling that they use has the rhythmic pattern of their surrounding language. So if they are babbling based on their ambient language, their surrounding language. We said that we can distinguish infants based on their babbles, whether that infant is Chinese, Russian, or Persian, just based on their babbles. One of the features of their babbles is the rhythmic pattern of their babbles, that they get it from their surrounding language. And about 9 months old, children, English-speaking children, prefer to listen to bisyllabic words with initial stress, that are trochaic words, rather than those that have final stress. So, this paves the way for them in order to recognize words, to segment speech into words. In order to see how this happens, an experiment has been done on 7.5 months old infants, and they listened to passages in which they had trochaic words like puppy and passages that had iambic words like guitar. After that, they were played a list of words. This list of words has some words that have been in the passages and words that have not been in the passages. So therefore, words like puppy and guitar were included in them because they have been used repeatedly in the passages that they have listened to before. The result showed that they listened significantly longer when they heard words like puppy. That is, they could have recognized that it's a word. because it has a trochaic word, and they have taken the stress to be the beginning of the word, and therefore they have responded to it. But words like guitar, they responded only to the stressed syllable, tar. And the interesting thing is that even when they produce these iambic words, the first production of these iambic words is the stressed part of that, showing that infants are sensitive to that stressed part, and even in their production, they would take it as the beginning of the word. So the results from this experiment, which is on their perception, and here a head turn technique has been used, preferential listening technique has been used, and they have seen that they listen longer to words like puppy compared to words that are iambic, and when they listen to iambic words, they start from the syllable that is stressed. Besides this experiment, the facts from production, like the data from their production, also shows that when they are producing words, they produce the stressed part of iambic words first, and then later they would learn that this word has another syllable and which is unstressed, and it comes at the beginning. So the take-home message from this experiment is that they use the stress pattern of the language in order to start learning words. They use the stress pattern of the language to start learning the words. This is called prosodic bootstrapping. In bootstrapping, we use information from one module in order to learn units from another module. We use information from phonology in order to learn words. Infants use information from phonology, from stress pattern, in order to learn the morphology of English, the lexical items of English. This is called prosodic bootstrapping. And we will see that we have other cases of bootstrapping from other modules. Besides stress pattern, frequency is also important. Like the number of times a certain sequence have been heard is also responsible for segmenting speech sounds. The more you hear a word, the more familiar it would be to the infant, and they would respond to that, and they would recognize it as a new word, as a word. So besides this experiment, the first experiment, another experiment, many experiments have been run, but we are referring to two of them. And the second experiment, what happened is that infants of 8 months age, they listened to 2 minutes of a speech. And this speech was formed by using 4 nonsense words: pabiku, tutibu, gulabu, babupu. So these words were produced by a speech synthesizer, and they were combined to make 3 different sentences. And there was no pauses or no phonetic cues, any intonation pitch pattern to show the word boundaries. Now the question is, could they distinguish the words of the language, which were these 4 words, from the sequence of syllables, that override word boundaries. Words, for example, like pabiku, compared to a word that would use, for example, the beginning, the end of another word, and the beginning of the next word. For example, a combination of tutibu and pabiku would be a part of that word, would be tibupa as a word. So do we have tibupa as a word in this language? No. It's a kind of stimulus that overrides word boundary. So now they are doing an experiment in order to make sure whether they can distinguish words of the language compared to just sequences of syllables that span word boundaries, like bu-babu compared to pabiku. The results showed that, however, the exposure has been for a limited time, which is here 2 minutes, and even if there was no boundary cues, the infant could distinguish words from part words, the whole words from parts of those words. How? Based on frequency, based on the number of times that they hear those words. So if we have combinations of beginning and end of words compared to words as a whole, which one has higher frequency? Of course, the words themselves, because they have been heard in that 2 minutes and in this test, but part words, well, they have not been heard as frequently as the words, because we have more combinations of these part words, the beginning and the end of one word combined. So the take-home message here is that those sequences that are occurred more frequently, they would be recognized by infants as words. So they would get information from two sources. One is the stress pattern, and they are sensitive to trochaic words, and the other one is from the frequency of words.